There are many types of verbs in Spanish, such as stem changing, irregular yo, and just irregular verbs in general, and in this video, I would like to describe every type of them in the past simple form. Even though not every verb will be included in the video, because you don't need all of them, I will explain all types of verbs in the past for the first video, but in the second one, I'll finish what I left off. The list will include weird stem changing verbs and irregular yo verbs, which I will separate by categories and explain how to use in the past, doing so as quickly as I can, starting with generic irregular verbs that have the TUV change in them. One of the verbs that falls into this category is tener, which doesn't follow the normal conjugation pattern of verbs ending in ER. Instead of following the syntax of normal verbs ending in ER, tener decides to use TUV as its main stem. Yo tuve means I had, tú tuviste, you had, él tuvo, he had, and so on. I recommend not focusing on these pronouns because they're not that useful in conversation, and so the other ones are more useful, like saying yo tuve un gato, I had a cat, or maybe if you want to include an action inside, you can say tú tuviste que hacer tu tarea, meaning you had to do your homework, and from there, you can make any sentence you want. After the verb tener, there are some verbs that have the word tener in them with a different prefix in the beginning, such as detener, retener, contener, and obtener. And in case you want to use any of them in the past tense, you have to remember to likewise change them with the TUV like you change tener. And with verbs like these, it's more useful to know them than to use them. Luckily for Spanish, there's a very useful verb that similarly uses the TUV ending, which is something you don't expect from this verb, and that is the verb estar. Rather than following normal conjugation patterns for verbs ending in AR, estar decides to use the TUV ending in all of its pronouns. Yo estuve means I was, tú estuviste, you were, él estuvo, he was, and so on. Like with the verb tener, I recommend not focusing on these pronouns because the other ones are more useful. One important rule you have to remember with estar in the past is that it's used for things done in the past that stayed in the past. In my video about estar, I talked about the applications of estar in the present, but in the past, it basically applies for a location more than to anything else. I can say a sentence like estoy en Madrid con él, I am in Madrid with him, but if I want to say this phrase in the past, I'd simply say yo estuve en Madrid con él, because my action was finished in the past, meaning that I never returned there. And of course, you can make any sentence you want, but just be careful with using locations in the past. The last verb that follows the UV ending is another verb you don't expect, and that is the verb andar, meaning to walk. Instead of following the normal conjugation of AR verbs, it decides to use the UV ending to indicate an action done in the past. With a verb like andar, I recommend just knowing the verb rather than using it. Next up, there are verbs that follow a PUS ending, which luckily share the same verb, but with different prefixes, and that is the verb poner. Instead of following the normal conjugation pattern of verbs ending in ER, Spanish decides to change it to PUS for all pronouns. Yo puse means I put in the past, tú pusiste, you put, él puso, he put, and so on. As always, don't concentrate on these pronouns because they're not that useful in conversation. If you were to say a sentence in the past using poner, you can say something like yo puse mi teléfono aquí, I put my phone here. Or maybe you can ask a question like ¿Dónde pusiste mi camisa? Meaning where did you put my shirt? Of course, you can say any sentence you want using this verb. I'm just giving a few examples to demonstrate how to use the verb. After poner, there are many other verbs that follow the PUS change like suponer, proponer, disponer, componer, and descomponer. And in case you have to use any of them in the past, remember to change them the same way you would change poner. And with verbs like these, I recommend just knowing them rather than using them. Next up, there are verbs ending in DUJ, and as far as I know, there are only 3 of them in Spanish, and they're very useful, like conducir, traducir, and producir. Rather than following the pattern of verbs ending in IR, Spanish decides to change them in the ending by adding DUJ. Taking the verb conducir as an example, yo conduje means I drove, tú condujiste means you drove, él condujo means he drove, and so on. I recommend knowing all pronouns except vosotros because the sentences that you can make with them are very useful. And the same concept applies to all of them whenever you decide to use them in the past any way you want. While we're on the category of DUJ, there are verbs that have an IJ ending in the past simple, meaning to say or to tell. Instead of following the pattern of IR verbs, Spanish gives the verb decir an IJ change. Yo dije, I spoke, tú dijiste, you spoke, and so on. With a verb like decir, I recommend knowing all pronouns except vosotros because these pronouns are very useful, especially when you incorporate every Spanish concept with them. For instance, I can say a sentence like yo te dije que voy a estar ahí, meaning I told you that I'm going to be there. Or maybe some simpler sentences would be better, like él me dijo eso ayer, he told me that yesterday. Or maybe ellos nos dijeron que están ahí, they told us that they are there. With a verb like decir, you can basically make any sentence you want depending on what you want to say. Actually, there are some verbs that put a prefix before decir decir, like predecir and contradecir, and whenever you want to use these verbs in the past, remember to change them like decir. And as always, it's more useful to know them than to use them. At last, there's the verb traer, meaning to bring, which is actually the last verb to include a jota in the past simple tense. Instead of following normal er verb conjugations, traer decides to add a jota in every pronoun. Yo traje, I brought, tú trajiste, you brought, and so on. With a verb like traer, I recommend knowing it rather than using it. Next up, there's the ist category, which is used through the verb hacer. Instead of following the normal er pattern, hacer uses an irregular pattern across all pronouns, and not only does it do that, but it has an irregular word within its irregular pattern for the él, ella pronoun, which is hizo, meaning he or she did or made. The reason Spanish does that is because when se is put before an o, it would have a ke sound like él hizo, but the word needs to maintain a se sound, so it uses zeta instead. With hacer, I recommend knowing all pronouns except vosotros because they're useful in conversation. For instance, a common question that is asked many times is ¿qué hiciste ayer?, meaning what did you do yesterday? And you can reply with yo hice mi tarea, meaning I did my homework. You can also use the verb as to make in a sentence like nosotros hicimos la cama, we made the bed, or maybe ellos hicieron un pastel para nosotros, they made a cake for us. And of course, you can make any sentence you want using hacer. There are also the verbs deshacer and rehacer, and in case you want to use any of them in the past, you have to change them as you would with hacer. But with these verbs, it's more useful to know them than to use them. The last category for this video is verbs that have the vin ending, like venir. Rather than following the normal pattern of verbs ending in ir, venir changes all of its conjugations in the past. Yo vine, I came, tú viniste, you came, and so on. I suggest knowing all pronouns except vosotros because it's a useful verb to know in the past. For instance, a common question with venir in the past is de donde viniste, meaning from where you came, and you can reply with yo vine de mi casa, I came from my house. You can also say something like vinimos del concierto por la noche, we came from the concert at night, or maybe ellos vinieron de la escuela, they came from the school. And of course, you can make any sentence you want using the verb venir in the past. And actually, there is the verb prevenir, meaning to prevent, and in case you want to use it in the past, remember to change it like the verb venir, and as always, it's a verb that's more useful to know than to utilize. This has been all types of irregular verbs in the past tense in Spanish, part 1.